For 600 years, one of the most powerful royal houses in Europe, the Habsburgs, made a cold, calculated habit of marrying their own relatives. In royal families from ancient Egypt to Spain, first cousins married first cousins, and uncles often married their own nieces. This wasn't about love, it was business. It was a strategy to lock down kingdoms, keep their bloodline pure, and hoard power within a tiny, closed circle. Their stories are grim warnings, written in the language of genetics, about what happens when a lineage gets twisted into an inescapable knot. The goal was simple: protect the crown, no matter the cost. But what if I told you that an ocean away, in the misty, isolated mountains of Appalachia, another family was doing the exact same thing, but for reasons much darker than any royal crown? For over 100 years, this family obsessively married its own, until their family tree stopped being a record of the past and became a countdown to their own extinction. They weren't protecting a kingdom. They were burying a secret. A secret so dark, they believed it could bring down the wrath of God himself. This is the story of a family more inbred than royalty, a terrifying legacy built on a monstrous lie, and the one child they tried to erase from history to protect it all. The legend of the Salo family doesn't start with monsters or ghosts. It starts the way many American stories do, with a man on the run. The story begins in the final, chaotic years of the 1700s with a man named Josiah Salo. The whispers that followed him across the ocean claimed he was running from a dark past in Europe, maybe a political scandal, or a duel that left a rich man dead. He didn't arrive in America poor and desperate, he arrived with gold in his pockets and secrets on his back. When he first saw the wild, untamed Appalachian mountains, he didn't see a challenge. He saw a fortress. He bought a massive piece of land, a valley so deep and remote that locals called it a holler, a place where the mountains were so tall they blocked out the sun for most of the day. He called it Salo's End. And there, far from the prying eyes of the world, he would build his kingdom. Most settlers worked together, building towns and communities. The Salos built their world in total isolation, like a castle pulling up its drawbridge. Using his wealth, Josiah built a huge, grim house of dark wood and stone that looked more like a feudal manor than a pioneer's cabin. He then surrounded it with everything they needed to survive: a grist mill to grind their grain, a timber mill to cut their wood, and a blacksmith's shop. He owned the only road into the valley, a winding dirt track he could shut down whenever he wanted. In his private kingdom, his word was law. The few other families who worked his land depended on him for everything. They paid him with their work, their loyalty, and most importantly, their silence. The first generation of Salo children born in that valley grew up breathing an air of suspicion. Their father, Josiah, taught them one core lesson: the outside world is a threat. It was a place full of meddling laws, strange people, and governments that would steal what was theirs. Before they were Americans, they were Salos. So, when it was time for them to marry, the choice was already made. How could they trust an outsider with the family's land and secrets? They couldn't. So, like a corporate merger designed to keep all assets in-house, the first Salo cousins married in the early 1800s. In the deep isolation of Salo's End, nobody thought it was strange. It was practical. It was just business. For the next 100 years, this pattern repeated with the chilling rhythm of a funeral drum. First cousins married first cousins. Uncles sometimes married their nieces. The family got bigger, but its bloodline was like a river flowing back into itself, never expanding. It just became more and more concentrated. To the small communities in the surrounding hills, the Salos became local legends. They were the rich, strange family in the hidden valley, seen only when they rode out on business, their faces like stone masks. Whispers began to follow them like their own shadows. Rumors spread about how they only married their own. About how every new baby looked uncannily like the last. That distinct Salo jawline, their pale skin, and their deep-set eyes became their unmistakable, haunting trademark. From the outside, it looked like a dynasty. A family that had built a safe, wealthy fortress in the mountains. But inside that gilded cage, something was starting to go wrong. With no new people, no new ideas, and no new blood, their world was shrinking. Their strange, paranoid beliefs began to curdle into something far more dangerous. They weren't just protecting their land anymore. They had started to believe they were protecting the purity of their blood. And that one practical choice, made a century ago, was about to grow into a dark and twisted mission. The question was no longer if they would take it too far, but how far they would go. The answer would be more horrifying than anyone could possibly imagine. The family's quiet slide into madness began with one man, Hezekiah Salo, born in the mid-1800s. Hezekiah wasn't a practical man like his ancestors. He was a mystic, a fanatic, a man with terrifying ideas he believed came directly from God. Growing up in the suffocating silence of Salo's end, surrounded only by the faces of his own relatives, he saw his family's extreme isolation not as an accident of history, but as a divine command. Hezekiah spent his days hunched over the heavy family Bible, its pages filled with the handwritten names of his ancestors. He ignored the parts about love and forgiveness. Instead, he obsessed over strange, obscure lines from the Old Testament, passages about sacred bloodlines and the sin of mixing with outsiders. He twisted these scriptures to fit his own warped, heroic story. He saw the modernizing outside world, with its telegraphs and railroads, as a rising tide of filth. In his mind, his family's long history of inbreeding was not just a tradition, it was a holy mission. In the grim parlor of the Salo mansion, he began to preach to his family. He told them they were a chosen people, an unbroken line with sacred blood, hand-picked by God to stay pure in a fallen world. Bringing in an outsider's blood, he thundered, wasn't just a bad idea anymore. It was the ultimate sin. Under Hezekiah's magnetic and terrifying leadership, the family's traditions hardened into unbreakable rules. Marrying a first cousin was no longer enough. The bloodline had to be made even purer, even more concentrated. And this is where the Salo legend takes its most horrifying turn, a turn that centers on Hezekiah's own daughter, Elspeth. According to the story, Elspeth was raised from birth for one single purpose, to be a vessel for the Salo legacy in its most absolute form. Hezekiah, now completely lost in his own twisted beliefs, declared that the purest child imaginable, a child of truly sacred blood, could only come from the most direct line possible, a union between a father and his own daughter. He used his mangled version of scripture to justify this monstrous act, convincing his terrified family that it was a necessary sacrifice, a holy test of their devotion. Elspeth, a girl who knew nothing of the world beyond the valley, was psychologically broken and forced into this union with her own father. It was a secret buried so deep it was never spoken of, even in the crushing silence of Salo's end. The legend says she bore him 3 children in the dark rooms of the mansion. The first was born with severe disabilities. The second was stillborn, a silent, heartbreaking reminder of the laws of nature they were trying to deny. To the fanatical Salos, these weren't tragedies. They were tests from God. The disabled child was hidden away in an upstairs room, a living ghost. The stillborn was buried in an unmarked grave. These losses only made them more paranoid, more certain they were on a righteous path. But then came the third child. A daughter, whom they named Sarah. And against all genetic odds, against all reason, Sarah was born perfectly, flawlessly healthy. She was bright, she was strong, her cries were loud, and her eyes were clear. For any other family, she would be a miracle. A blessing. But in the twisted world of Salo's end, she was a catastrophe. Sarah's perfect health was the most terrifying thing that could have possibly happened. It was living, breathing proof that Hezekiah was a fraud. Her very existence screamed that his entire religion was a grotesque lie. Her health showed that their blood wasn't special, and their path wasn't divine. If a child born from such a forbidden act could be perfectly normal, then their entire belief system, the foundation of their isolation, their pride, and their cruelty, was built on nothing. They looked at this beautiful, healthy little girl not with love, but with cold, rising fear. They knew, with the chilling certainty of fanatics whose faith has been shattered, that she could not be allowed to exist. This perfect child had to be erased. But how do you erase a living, breathing child? For the Salo family, the answer wasn't murder. That would be a clear sin, a stain they couldn't wash away. No, the solution had to be more total. The solution was to make her vanish as if she had never been born. Letting Sarah grow up in Salo's end, a perfect and healthy girl, would be like letting a time bomb tick at the heart of their world. Every day of her life would be a silent mockery of their beliefs. She had to disappear. The legend says that Hezekiah, a man of immense local power, used his money to make it happen. He orchestrated what was essentially an act of human trafficking disguised as charity. He looked for a man whose desperation would be the lock on his secret. The stories point to a doctor in a town 2 counties over, a man with a good reputation but a secret, ruinous gambling problem. Hezekiah learned of the doctor's crushing debts and saw his chance. A secret meeting was arranged. No names were used, only terms. The doctor and his wife were childless and about to lose their home. Hezekiah offered to pay off all their debts and give them a generous sum of money to live on for the rest of their lives. In return, they would take an infant girl, raise her as their own, and never ask a single question about where she came from. The deal was sealed with a heavy bag of cash. The couple lived far enough away that no one would ever recognize the faint sallow features that might appear in the girl's face. The exchange was done in the dead of night. One of Hezekiah's most loyal men drove a wagon to a crossroads on a moonless night. The infant Sarah, wrapped in a plain blanket, was handed over without a word. By morning, she was gone. Her cradle in the Salo mansion was empty. Back in Salo's end, a different kind of erasure was happening. Sarah's existence was scrubbed from memory. In a grim family ritual, Hezekiah took a knife and physically scraped her name from the birth records in the family Bible, leaving a jagged scar on the page. Her cradle, her blanket, and her few toys were piled in the yard and burned, the smoke rising into the sky like a dark prayer. A new rule was declared: Sarah was never to be spoken of again. For the younger Salos, she simply never existed. For the elders who knew, she became a shared, unspeakable secret, a ghost that haunted the silence between their words. The cover-up was perfect. But secrets, like water, always find a way to leak out. The story was never a documented fact, but a ghost story pieced together from whispers over decades. There's a persistent tale of a traveling census taker who noted an infant girl at the Salo house on one visit. When he returned the next year, she was gone. When he politely asked about her, he was met with such cold, threatening stares that he backed away and never asked again. There are also rumored deathbed confessions of an old midwife from a nearby valley, a woman who swore she had delivered a perfectly formed Salo baby girl who vanished from the face of the earth just weeks later. The mother, Elspeth, became a ghost in her own home. The loss of her one healthy child, the one spark of hope in her tormented life, shattered her spirit. She drifted through the Salo mansion like a sleepwalker, a constant, walking reminder of the family's greatest sin. The secret didn't save them. It poisoned them from the inside out. They had executed the perfect cover-up, but in doing so, they had damned themselves to be forever haunted by the memory of the one healthy life they had thrown away. But where does this chilling story come from? Over the years, historians and folklorists have tried to pin down the truth of the Salo family, searching for any concrete proof of their existence. They've scoured census data, land deeds, and old newspaper articles, but to no avail. The Salos, if they were real, were masters at staying hidden, leaving almost no trace in the historical record. They remain ghosts, a story whispered in the mountains. Because the facts are so elusive, some argue the legend isn't about a single family at all, but is instead a dark mirror reflecting one of the oldest and most hurtful stereotypes about the people of Appalachia, the ugly myth of the inbred hillbilly. That myth was largely an invention, created by outsiders in the late 1800s. Writers from northern cities came to Appalachia looking for sensational stories and painted a picture of mountain people as backward and strange. When they tried to explain the region's real problems, like poverty and isolation, they reached for a shocking and simple explanation: inbreeding. This toxic idea was then spread in magazines and movies, creating a cruel and lasting caricature. This stereotype was also used as a weapon. As big coal and timber companies looked to take over the region's rich resources, the image of the degenerate hillbilly suggested the local people were too simple or flawed to manage their own land, making it easier for outsiders to take it from them. But what does science say about the stereotype itself? In 1980, anthropologist Robert Tincher investigated this very myth. He conducted a massive study of 140 years of marriage records from a remote area in eastern Kentucky, expecting to find high rates of inbreeding. He found the exact opposite. His research proved that marriage between cousins in Appalachia was no more common than in other isolated rural communities around the world. In any tiny, geographically cut-off community, the dating pool is naturally small. So, what is the Salo story? Is it the one horrifying exception to the rule, a true story so dark it was successfully erased? Or is it a horror story that acts like a caricature, taking the ugliest ideas about Appalachian people and blowing them up into a monster movie? The legend isn't a simple history lesson. It's a powerful, dark piece of folklore that tells us far more about the fears and prejudices of the outside world than it does about the real people who call the mountains of Appalachia home. Regardless of its historical roots, the legend itself has a definitive, chilling end. The story of the Salo family doesn't conclude with a fiery explosion. It ends with a slow, quiet rot, like a great oak tree decaying from within. The great secret of the erased child didn't save them. It became the cancer that ate their family from the inside out. The generations that came after Hezekiah were physically and mentally frail. The genetic price for their choices finally came due. The problems they once dismissed as spiritual trials became impossible to ignore. Children were born with heart defects, weak immune systems, and other devastating disabilities. The once mighty Salo family began to shrink, their numbers dropping with each passing year. The strength and cunning that allowed Josiah to build his kingdom was gone, replaced by sickness and a creeping sense of doom. Their wealth, tied to land they could no longer manage, vanished. The great mill fell apart, its water well choked with weeds. The fields grew wild, and the grim Salo mansion began to rot, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over a decaying empire. By the middle of the 20th century, the Salo dynasty was over. According to the legend, the last members of the family died alone in state-run hospitals, their famous name now just a footnote in dusty county records. Their obsession with protecting their bloodline led directly to its complete extinction. They guarded their terrible secret to the very end, and it cost them everything. But what about Sarah? The healthy child who was cast out. Her story is the most powerful part of the legend, because it has no ending. Given a new name and a new family, she would have grown up with no idea of the dark, twisted legacy flowing in her veins. The folklore speculates endlessly about her. Did she live a long, happy life? Did she marry and have children of her own? The most powerful version of the tale insists that her family line thrived. Her children and grandchildren, with no clue about their origins, became the doctors, teachers, and engineers that the Salos, in their paranoia, had rejected. They were strong, intelligent people living full lives out in the very world the Salos despised. They were the living picture of the health and vitality that the Salos had literally thrown away in the dark of night. And that is the final, crushing irony of the legend. The Salo family erased a child to protect their legacy, but in the end, that child may have become the only legacy that survived. The family that hid itself away in the valley withered and died, consumed by its own dark beliefs. But the bloodline they cast out into the world, the branch they tried to chop from their family tree, flourished. The story of the Salos, whether a true account or a chilling parable, stands as a dark monument to the poison of secrets, and the inescapable truth that the strongest prisons are the ones we build for ourselves. The line between history and legend is always blurry. It's a shadowy space where facts give way to the stories we tell to make sense of our deepest fears. The legend of the Salo family lives in those shadows, a grim testament to the power of a good story. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of Appalachia's darkest tales. What do you think is the power of a legend like this? Does a story like this help us understand the nature of prejudice, or does it just risk keeping a hurtful myth alive for another generation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing so you don't miss our next expedition into the forgotten corners of the past.